In 1845, Tennessee was a state caught between the past and the future. The frontier was rapidly expanding as settlers pushed westward in search of opportunity, and the agricultural boom promised prosperity. The landscape was changing, with new towns emerging and industries beginning to develop, setting the stage for what would become a period of unprecedented growth in the United States. Most historians and local accounts of the time focus on the rising fortunes of these new communities, the expansion of the American frontier, and the promise of agricultural prosperity that made the state a key player in the American story. But the true story of Tennessee in 1845, buried beneath the tales of expansion and progress, lies in a discovery made not in the bustling towns but deep within the soil of White County, Tennessee. This discovery would not make the front pages of newspapers for long, nor would it become part of the official narrative of the state's growth. Instead, it was a tale that was quickly swept under the rug, hidden in the margins of history and erased from public memory. The story begins with an ordinary task. A group of workers was hired to dig a well on the property of William Shumet, a landowner in White County. The job seemed simple enough. Dig a hole deep enough to reach groundwater, ensuring a reliable source of water for the farm. The workers set to work, using the typical tools of the day to dig through the soil. It was a straightforward task with no indication of what would unfold beneath their feet. However, as the workers dug deeper, at a surprising depth of 50 feet, far deeper than what was required for a typical well, they encountered something completely unexpected. What they unearthed was not the usual mixture of bedrock, water, and soil but bones. At first, the workers likely believed they had come across animal remains, perhaps from a large creature. But the size of the bones was staggering, unlike anything they had seen before. The bones did not match the remains of any known animal species. Instead, they appeared to belong to something far larger. These bones, when examined, were not just unusual, they were extraordinary. The size of the skeletal remains suggested they could have belonged to a creature that stood between 18 to 20 feet tall. The skull was so large that it was said to be able to fit over the head of an average-sized adult man like a helmet. The bones were incredibly heavy, so heavy in fact that it took multiple men to lift them. The ribs of the skeleton were so thick that they resembled large fence posts, and the teeth were described as being as large as a human thumb. This discovery was so unusual that it quickly drew the attention of local newspapers. Headlines soon began to circulate, referring to the finding as the Tennessee Giant. The public was astonished. It was unlike any discovery they had ever heard of before. Witnesses reported seeing workers standing beside bones so large that even grown men appeared small in comparison. For a short period, the discovery became a spectacle. The giant skeleton was publicly displayed, and citizens from the surrounding areas paid to see the remains for themselves. Newspapers ran detailed reports, describing the massive bones and providing measurements that seemed to defy reason. For a time, it seemed that this extraordinary discovery would capture the public's imagination and dominate the scientific conversation. However, despite the detailed documentation and the overwhelming evidence of something remarkable, the excitement surrounding the Tennessee Giant quickly faded. The scientific community, which had initially shown interest, soon dismissed the discovery. The remains were quickly classified as either misidentified animal bones or the result of a genetic anomaly. Some even claimed that the discovery was nothing more than an exaggerated frontier tale, a piece of folklore that had grown out of proportion in the retelling. The public was soon told to move on, and the story was relegated to the background, fading from the collective memory. However, there was more to the story than the quick dismissal by authorities. The reports published in the days and weeks following the discovery tell a different story, a story of physical evidence too substantial to ignore. These were not random claims or exaggerated rumors. The bones had been examined, measured, and witnessed by many individuals. The skeleton had been publicly displayed for weeks, with hundreds of people, possibly even thousands, observing the remains firsthand. Photographs were taken, and the dimensions of the skeleton were recorded in the press. The evidence was there and it was undeniable. But despite this, the remains disappeared. Not gradually, not through natural decay, but swiftly and completely. No bones were retained for scientific study, no photographs were preserved for future generations, and no records were kept to ensure that the discovery would be remembered. What happened to the Tennessee giant? The answers remain elusive. The skeleton was removed from public display, and within a remarkably short period, it vanished from the historical record. Official explanations suggested that the bones were too fragile to be preserved, or that they were returned to the Shoemate family who owned the land. But these explanations failed to account for the strange completeness of the disappearance. How could such a significant discovery, one that had captivated so many, simply vanish without a trace? There was no scientific follow-up, no attempt to study the remains further, and no effort to preserve the discovery for future generations. The disappearance of the Tennessee giant is not an isolated incident. As we will explore further, similar discoveries of giant skeletons were made across the United States in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Each of these discoveries followed a strikingly similar pattern. Oversized skeletal remains that defied conventional biology, found at depths far beyond typical burial practices, and then, just as quickly, disappeared from public view. Despite the public fascination and the detailed documentation of these findings, the story of the Tennessee giant, and the many other giant discoveries across North America, was systematically erased from history. The questions raised by these findings have never been fully addressed, and the physical evidence so thoroughly documented at the time remains hidden. What happened to these discoveries? Why were they dismissed, and why did the evidence vanish so completely? The answer may lie in a larger mystery, one that challenges everything we think we know about the history of humanity in North America. The story of the Tennessee giant is just one piece of this larger puzzle, a glimpse into a chapter of human history that was never meant to be uncovered. The sudden and unexplained disappearance of the giant skeleton discovered in Tennessee in 1845 raises several troubling questions. While the initial excitement surrounding the discovery led to public exhibitions and detailed newspaper reports, the aftermath tells a different, more sinister story. Rather than being preserved and studied, the remains were swiftly removed from public view. No bones were kept for further research, no photographs were retained, and no official studies were conducted to validate the discovery. What's even more disturbing is that the giant skeleton was completely erased from the historical record, as if it had never existed. The official narrative surrounding the Tennessee giant's disappearance has remained vague and unsatisfying. The most commonly cited explanation for the removal of the skeleton was that the bones were too fragile to continue displaying, or perhaps they were returned to the Shoemate family. Yet, these excuses fail to explain the scale of the disappearance. How could such an important discovery, one that had been widely documented and thoroughly witnessed, simply vanish without a trace? The evidence was overwhelming, and the skeleton's presence had captivated the public for weeks. It was not just a curiosity but a major event in American history. So why did it disappear so completely? As we look closer, the pattern of this mysterious disappearance becomes even more pronounced. Similar discoveries of giant skeletons were made throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, from the Ohio Valley to Kentucky and Tennessee. In each case, the skeletal remains exhibited the same remarkable proportions, giants standing between 18 to 20 feet tall, with skulls large enough to fit over the heads of grown men and bones heavy enough to require multiple people to lift them. And just like the Tennessee giant, these remains were found at extraordinary depths, far beyond what would be expected from natural burial practices. These discoveries were not isolated incidents but part of a larger trend that spanned across several states in the U.S. Workers unearthed giant skeletons in burial mounds during the excavation of agricultural fields, and even while building construction projects. In every case, the bones exhibited proportions that defied biology and challenged the prevailing understanding of human history. And yet, the same thing happened. The remains disappeared. Whether they were buried again, placed into private collections, or simply destroyed, the public never saw these giants again. Newspaper articles from the time provide a glimpse into the scale of these findings. Accounts describe workers standing beside bones so large that even the most muscular men seemed diminutive by comparison. The size and weight of the bones were consistently documented, and many witnesses recounted their experiences in great detail. However, despite these detailed reports, the discoveries were quickly discredited. Local authorities and scientific institutions either dismissed them as the result of misidentification or genetic abnormalities, or they attributed them to folklore, convenient explanations that allowed them to close the book on what should have been one of the most important archaeological discoveries in history. As the years passed, the documentation of these giant discoveries became increasingly sparse. The newspaper reports became fewer and farther between, and when they did appear, they were less detailed and often dismissed the findings with vague language, such as unusually large remains or abnormal skeletal structures. The once prominent reports that had described the giant skeletons with precision were now reduced to mere footnotes, and the language used to discuss these discoveries became increasingly dismissive and evasive. It was as if there was a concerted effort to downplay the significance of the findings and to erase them from public memory. The scientific community, which had initially shown interest in the Tennessee giant and similar discoveries, quickly turned its back on these findings. Instead of pursuing further research into the anomalous remains, many scientists chose to ignore them altogether. The bones were either written off as misidentifications of animal remains or classified as bizarre genetic mutations, explanations that failed to account for the consistency of the measurements across multiple discoveries. And when researchers tried to investigate these findings further, they encountered significant obstacles. In some cases, institutions with previously documented giant skeletons simply refused to release any further information. Government repositories, which had acknowledged receiving these skeletal remains, became increasingly uncooperative when researchers attempted to locate the specimens. Archaeological expeditions were cut short, and sites where giant remains had been discovered were cordoned off, preventing further excavation. Some areas were even officially designated as Native American burial sites, a convenient classification that prevented further investigation under the guise of cultural respect. But this decision raised a troubling question. Why were certain burial sites protected while others, which seemed to contain evidence of a much older civilization, were not? The suppression of the giant skeleton discoveries and the subsequent reduction of their significance point to a deliberate effort to control the narrative of human history. If these giant skeletons were indeed the remains of a lost, ancient human population, it would completely disrupt the accepted chronology of human migration to North America. These giants would predate the Native American cultures we recognize today, challenging the foundation of modern archaeology and rewriting the history of human civilization on the continent. Furthermore, the deliberate act of removing the physical evidence and minimizing the documentation suggests that there was an institutional desire to keep the public from knowing the truth. If these discoveries were to be fully acknowledged, it would force a re-evaluation of everything we know about the origins of humanity in the Americas. It would mean that there were other civilizations in North America long before the ancestors of the Native American tribes arrived. This could have enormous implications for our understanding of human history and our conception of who the first peoples of the Americas really were. But rather than confronting this new and uncomfortable truth, the institutions involved chose to suppress it. The remains were quietly removed from public view, the documentation was minimized, and the discoveries were dismissed as anomalies or outright fabrications. This systematic erasure of evidence is not just an unfortunate oversight, it's a deliberate act of historical revisionism. The disappearance of the giant skeletons across North America, particularly the one discovered in Tennessee in 1845, poses one of the most perplexing and controversial questions in the field of archaeology and history. The erasure of these discoveries is not just an isolated incident but part of a broader pattern of suppression, which has led many to question the true history of human civilization in the Americas. What if the skeletal remains found across the continent were not from a tribe or culture we recognize today? What if they belonged to an entirely different human population, one that existed long before the ancestors of modern Native American groups arrived? If this were true, it would fundamentally change our understanding of the peopling of North America and rewrite human history itself. For over a century, the discoveries of giant skeletons were treated with dismissiveness, their significance reduced to folklore or misidentifications. Despite numerous reports and eyewitness testimonies, the evidence was systematically removed, as if it was not just inconvenient but dangerous to the narrative that we have long accepted. The idea that giants roamed North America, beings who were much taller and more robust than any known human populations, was too radical to entertain. Instead, the official narrative became one of avoidance, with key pieces of evidence disappearing without explanation. But this suppression is not a recent phenomenon. In fact, the story of the Tennessee giant is only one chapter in a much longer tale of mysterious discoveries that challenge conventional historical understanding. Across the United States, from Tennessee to Ohio and Kentucky, reports surfaced of giant skeletons unearthed during the excavation of burial mounds and while conducting construction projects. These remains often showed the same remarkable features: extraordinarily large bones, skulls that could fit over an adult's head, and skeletal structures that seemed impossible according to known biological norms. And yet, each of these discoveries followed the same pattern: documentation, public interest, and then a quiet and deliberate disappearance. What makes this pattern even more intriguing is the consistency with which it occurred. In every case, the bones were buried at extraordinary depths, far deeper than would be expected from ordinary burial practices. These remains were not the scattered fragments of ancient animals or random fossilized bones. They were carefully positioned skeletons, often found in seated positions or surrounded by burial goods, suggesting ritualistic burial practices. This implied a sophisticated and organized culture capable of monumental construction and burial rituals, a people whose legacy has since been obscured and forgotten. The geographical spread of these discoveries is another piece of the puzzle. While many of the skeletal remains were found in burial mounds across the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes region, other sites were located across a vast expanse, from the Gulf Coast to the Great Plains. Each of these sites revealed similar patterns: oversized skeletal remains, well-preserved burial sites, and evidence of advanced construction techniques. But despite the compelling evidence of an ancient civilization, the remains were systematically removed from public access. They were either hidden away in private collections, destroyed, or returned to the earth from which they came. These findings raise a critical question: why were they suppressed? If these skeletons represented an ancient human population, older than the recognized Native American tribes, then what would that mean for our understanding of the history of human migration to North America? If the giants had built the mounds and constructed the earthworks, it would suggest that another civilization predated the ones we recognize today. This would completely undermine the traditional narratives of human migration and settlement in the Americas, forcing historians to reconsider long-established theories about how the first peoples arrived on the continent. This is where the concept of historical revisionism becomes critical. The discovery of giants in burial mounds and other archaeological sites, if fully acknowledged, would force a re-evaluation of the timeline of human history. If giants existed in North America long before the Native American cultures we are familiar with, it would fundamentally change our understanding of who the first humans were. And if this earlier civilization had been capable of constructing large-scale monuments and burial structures, it would suggest a cultural sophistication that predates what we have been taught. But this truth has been deliberately suppressed. The discoveries that were made in the 19th and early 20th centuries were documented and witnessed by numerous individuals, yet within a few decades the evidence disappeared. Newspaper accounts began to downplay the significance of the findings, reducing them to mere curiosities or misidentifications. The skeletons were removed from museums and placed in private collections, never to be seen again.